All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chapter 2. Just like last time, we're going to run through our second chapter here from our textbook. This is only a review. This is trying to, keyword trying, to simulate what we would do as if we were in class and we were ready for some lectures. So let's get into this chapter. You can always check out some of these things I have here on the slides when I upload the PowerPoints. They practice multiple choice questions as if we were to do a do now in class. But anyways, let's get to the content here. Chapter 2 starts to get into some good stuff here that we definitely need to know. So first off, we left off with in chapter 1 talking about Portugal and Spain and how they were splitting up this new empire of theirs in the New World. And I said that we would also talk about the English, the French, and the Dutch. And now let's get to the big one here, the one that we really have to know a lot about, and that would be England. So England really is on the rise. Their empire is on the rise after they were able to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588, and they begin their colonization in the 13 colonies, as we know. They have a couple different types of colonies. They're not all exactly the same. The three types of colonies, we have joint stock companies in which multiple people invest in a colony. It's also referred to as a corporate colony. So all these people that invest, they are obviously all tied to the success or the failure of that colony, financially speaking. A proprietorship is the land or the colony given to a person by the king. Okay, and we'll see some of those coming up. That one person is in charge. And then finally, a royal colony is a colony that, just like it sounds like, it's royal, it's controlled by the crown, okay, by the monarchy back in England. The very first English colony in the New World will be called Roanoke, and this was a failure. There's a big mystery as to what happened to this colony. We don't really know. About roughly 100 settlers with Walter Raleigh went in 1587. He comes back a year later, and all of a sudden he is astonished to see everybody is gone. It's very possible they all died. It's very possible that some died and some intermingled with the Native Americans to survive, but we do not know. So the first try at this was not successful. Let's talk about some of the successful colonies that we come to know as modern day states. And Virginia and Maryland are the first major colonies that the English set up in what we call the southern region, or what we call the Chesapeake area. So these two, Virginia and Maryland, they are permanent colonies by the English, and the first successful colony or town, if you will, that is set up by the English in the Chesapeake area is called Jamestown in 1607. Now, this was a joint stock company, which if you remember from a couple minutes ago, that this is multiple people investing in this colony. And this colony, although we say it was successful, it was very close to failing. A lot of people, you have to remember, a lot of these white Europeans, they are, for lack of a better word, they're lazy. And they don't really want to, nor are they used to, working manual labor every single day. And this is a new world, remember. This is a place where you have to start everything from scratch. There is no hospital. There is no, restaurant. There is no bar. There's no services or anything that can give you this reprieve from the usual. So you do see a starving period these first couple of years, very hard for people to survive in Jamestown. And if it weren't for these two men at the bottom of the slide here, John Smith and John Rolfe, they come to save the day. Now, John Smith, he comes to save the day because he implements a military discipline, which means he basically says to everybody, you want to eat dinner tonight, you have to work. And if you don't work, you don't eat. And that is obviously huge because that forces people to work because they obviously need to eat. And John Smith, also, you might recognize his name if you're a huge Disney fan, but Disney got it wrong with the famous movie called Pocahontas. Yes, Pocahontas was real. We'll talk about her in a few moments, but John Smith was not the guy in real life that she marries. The real guy that she marries is the guy at the way bottom, John Rolfe. John Rolfe not only marries Pocahontas to end something, we'll talk about it in a few moments, but as I said before, he saves the colony because he introduces a very important crop to this area, tobacco. Tobacco is very important because it becomes the main crop that is going to be exported from the colonies in this Chesapeake and later on southern areas. And it grows really, really well in this climate, this area. Okay, so as we can see, tobacco becomes the major cash crop of the Chesapeake area. That's both Maryland and the Virginia colony. Now, when we're talking about this cash crop business that is now developing here, we need people to work the field. And before we get to the story of slavery, we have to talk about indentured servitude. Now, indentured servants were the people that were forced basically to labor the lands. And this is usually someone who is not forced for life, but instead they're given a contract, 4 to 7 years. A lot of the times, indentured servants were people that were coming over from England that were in the jails, and they basically were given an opportunity that said, hey, listen, if you'd like to get out of jail, why don't you come to the New World and work 4 to 7 years, and after you're done, you have your freedom. And people in jail said, that's awesome. Now, it sounds like a really good deal. Is there a catch? Yes, there is. Most times, the people that came over as indentured servants did not outlive their contracts, so they died in those 4 to 7 years or earlier, and they were never given their freedom and things like that. So for the beginning of our story here about manual labor and who's working the fields, indentured servitude seemed to work. We'll talk about how we get to slavery in a little bit. Now, the headright system is the English system of giving lands to people coming over to the New World. Now, we talked about the encomienda system. That was the Spanish way of giving land and giving incentive to people to come over. And the English have their own version, and this one is giving 50 acres to somebody if you pay for another person's journey. So if I'm living in the Chesapeake area and I want 50 acres more of property, all I have to do is send over some money to somebody in England to pay for their trip to the New World, and there you go, I get 50 more acres. Awesome. Hence why the English colonies become so much bigger and so much more populated than the others, because there wasn't a great incentive for the French or for the Spanish, for example, when it came to getting people to come over to their New World colonies. A couple of important things to mention. You see the House of Burgesses is established in 1619. That's one of your vocabulary terms. This is extremely important. The exam really likes to focus on this. We're going to talk about all of the colonies, obviously, and one of the things that we need to focus on is that we see early forms of what we call representative democracy or representative government. What we're doing is we're trying to say, how do we get what we have today in America? Where does it come from? And we have to go all the way back to the beginning, which is where we are right now. The House of Burgesses is essentially Congress. It's a elected body of government in Virginia. The people that are elected to the House of Burgesses are elected by the people. They're not appointed by the king. They're not any form of monarchy. Okay, this is democracy. This is different. Okay, and that's what makes us so unique. So make sure you know Virginia's example of House of Burgesses, our first form so far that we've talked about of representative government. Now, problems that are beginning to develop. Tobacco, although it grows really nicely in this Chesapeake area, it's destroying the land, which means people are going to want more and more land, which means they're going to head further into the interior of the Chesapeake area to take up more land. Well, who's already there? As you may have guessed, the Native Americans. So you're going to start to see some tensions there. So let's talk about those tensions and let's talk about how things boil over. So you're going to see this hostile relationship between the Native Americans and these European settlers. And you're going to see a couple of conflicts. And first off, one of the major conflicts is called the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. That's a range from 1610 to 1646. You don't necessarily have to know those years, but just to give you some perspective there. And the first war ends with the marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. So I mentioned Pocahontas before. She does not marry John Smith like the Disney cartoon. She actually marries John Rolfe. Unfortunately, things heat up once again after 1614. You're going to see in 1622 a second war. And ultimately, what's going to happen to the Native Americans is not only defeat by the Europeans, but you're going to see disease really wipe them out. So the sad story of Native Americans in our history, what you're going to find is that the stories are mostly the same. They're very similar. And it usually ends with the Native Americans being defeated. And one of the biggest things defeating them is the interaction with the Europeans, and that would be the effects of the diseases that they are not immune to. So that is very bad for them. Okay, just take away the Anglo-Powhatan Wars just as the cause by the Europeans wanting more land and the conflict, okay, between the Europeans, the natives, and then the effect. Okay, the effect that is the Native Americans lose out. Okay, don't get focused in the details here. Just know the overall example causes and effects. Okay, and to look at Jamestown there. Now let's talk about Jamestown once more with something to do with a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. This is also very, very important that you need to know because the Bacon's Rebellion is a huge turning point in our early history. So, in Jamestown, we're going to see frustrations grow. As we talked about, tobacco grows really well. The people there in the Chesapeake area, they're all about growing it, and they're going to need more and more land because it just keeps eating up, and the land is destroyed by tobacco, which means a lot of conflict with the Native Americans. So we have that with trying to heat up the tensions there and the frustrations of these European settlers. What else is getting them ticked off? The lack of political power. The people that are taking part in the House of Burgesses, as I mentioned before, the representative government body, they're not everybody. Okay, yeah, it's great that we have a history of democracy. However, the very beginning of our country, the people that are voting, especially in the House of Burgesses, are your plantation elite, your wealthy white dudes who own a lot of land, hundreds of acres of land. Okay, it's not every single person, especially not women, especially not poor. Then the last thing that really starts to tick off the settlers is that the Governor Berkeley, he is enjoying a relative good relationship, a trading relationship with Native Americans. And every time you see settlers go outside of the Jamestown fence, it seems to be that they are being attacked. And they say, hey, Governor, you're supposed to protect us. And the governor says, well, we're trading with the Native Americans. I don't really want to tick them off, so I'm not really going to do anything. I'm not going to punish the Native Americans. And after this continues and continues, and more settlers are attacked or even killed, the settlers, led by Nathaniel Bacon, they've had enough, and they rise up not against the Native Americans specifically, but really against the Governor Berkeley. Okay, and they go outside of Jamestown, they hack up a bunch of Native Americans, they come back, they're going to attack the governor, and it seems like they're going to, overthrow or have a coup here. Well, actually, Nathaniel Bacon winds up dying of dysentery, so the whole thing kind of falls apart. So why do we talk about this whole mess? Why do I mention Nathaniel Bacon and his rebellion? Because what happened was all of his followers, the people that were his little posse, his boys that were following him into this rebellion, they actually used to be indentured servants. You say, okay, so what? Why does that matter? Well, previously I had mentioned that indentured servitude was working for the colonies because people were not outliving their contracts. Well, now people are outliving their contracts, they're getting their freedom, and what's the one thing they know how to do in this new world? Farm. They're becoming competition for the people, the very people that once owned them, if you will. And so you're going to start to see, because of Nathaniel Bacon and because of his followers that were indentured servants, they're going to start to say, you know what, we don't want more indentured servants here. We want people that are always going to be slaves. And that's what leads the transition to the African chattel slave trade. Okay, the slavery that we know it. Okay, and Nathaniel Bacon and his Bacon's Rebellion is a huge turning point for just that. All right, let's wrap up this chapter by talking about the couple of other colonies that are going to exist besides Virginia in this region. First off, Maryland. Maryland, very straightforward, okay? It is proprietorship, which if you remember, that's one person is given control of it. That would be Lord Baltimore, which if you know anything about Maryland, capital is Baltimore, makes sense. And the biggest thing to take away from Maryland, besides the plantations and stuff, just like Virginia, is that you're going to see Lord Baltimore enact something called the Act of Toleration, 1649. This is the first time we ever see a law having to give or having to do with religious freedom, I should say. And if you read, though, it says religious freedom for all Christians. Okay, so religious freedom, but only for Catholics. Sorry Jews, sorry Muslims, etc. So it's a small step towards religious freedom. Again, I told you before when I mentioned the House of Burgesses, we're trying to draw the connections of where do we get the things that we have today, things like democracy, things like freedom of religion, our First Amendment. Well, we draw it back to the beginning here, and the Act of Toleration is the first example of such religious toleration. Okay, lastly, the bottom colonies, the southern ones, North and South Carolina and Georgia. So South Carolina is a cash crop economy, very much just like Virginia, what we just talked about, except rice is what really takes off there because the environment is much more warm. You're also going to see North Carolina take on a cash crop economy, and they're going to be based off of tobacco. And the North and South Carolina, you are going to see slaves in them. The further south you go, the more slaves you're going to see. So North Carolina has some, but not many slaves. And then South Carolina has way more. And then the way bottom, Georgia, a lot of slaves down there. You're actually going to see more slaves in some of these southern colonies than you will white plantation owners. Okay, and that will become an issue when it comes time for the Constitution and talking about representation in Congress. But that's a story for a different day. I put the Caribbean on there. You don't have to know about Barbados and Jamaica. They were also controlled by the English. They were also cash crop economies that were controlled by the English and very similar to our Carolinas and Georgia. The interesting thing about Georgia is that Georgia was not a very well populated colony. It was a buffer between us and Spanish Florida and also the French out west. It also was kind of a almost like the jail colony, if you will, meaning that if you did something bad, if you were in debt, if you maybe got into trouble, you killed somebody, sometimes you were sent down to Georgia because they just didn't know what to do with you. And so Georgia wasn't a very well populated colony, but you do see a lot of different types of people in Georgia. But as for Georgia, they also are going to make some of their money off of cash crop. But that was just an interesting story about Georgia. Okay, that is going to wrap it up for us for Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got something out of this. Feel free to hit a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, I'm always here, so please ask me. Other than that, have a wonderful, wonderful day.